Welcome to Conversations. Conversations is a ministry of biblical foundations. In our session, we want to take a brief historical overview of the nation of Israel as a legitimate people, as a legitimate country and state, and leading up to Israel's rightful response in Operation Iron Sword to the unimaginable butchery that took place on October 7th, 2023 by the terrorist group Hamas. Israel is currently in the midst of an unprovoked war, a war that has been thrust upon them by the terrorist group Hamas. Early Saturday morning, October the 7th, on Simchat Torah, Jewish families were awakened by a barrage of 5,000 rockets being fired from Gaza into Israel. Simultaneously, as families scurried for their bomb shelters, 3,000 Hamas terrorists broke through the southern security fence between Gaza and Israel. They came running, riding bicycles, motorcycles, ATVs, flying over on motorized hang gliders. Hamas fighters, Arab women and children even joined in. Many terrorists came through on trucks using the humanitarian road that runs from Israel into Gaza, where Israel has regularly shipped humanitarian aid to the civilians of Gaza. Their sole purpose was to butcher, in the most atrocious ways, Jewish civilians, beginning with the communities closest to Gaza and going as far as they could. They butchered babies, children, men and women of all ages, the elderly. They raped women and children. They slaughtered 1,200 innocent, unarmed civilians and took 250 hostages into Gaza. This was demonic butchery. Hamas is a cult of death. This was the worst situation for Israel since the Holocaust. This attack was secretly planned by a few high-ranking leaders over the years. In a news conference, President Herzog of Israel revealed the handbook Hamas had developed for this attack of terrorism. Usually in the past, there has been a barrage of rockets for a time until the IDF and the IAF deal with this, but this attack was different. To date, over 11,000 rockets have been fired at Israel. Since this Black Day, other terrorist groups have joined Hamas. Iran has called for Arab countries to unite together against Israel. An ex-chief Hamas leader has called for a global day of jihad on Jews. As in the Holocaust, denial of the October 7th atrocities began to take place on the same day of the attack. And this has escalated around the world by leftist media and pro-Hamas groups on university campuses, various news outlets, and in the streets of many cities. Israel must deal with these terrorists who are hiding out in Gaza, using Gaza civilians as shields, and now using the hostages as human shields. This is what makes this war so difficult and dangerous. Almost immediately, the same old media attacks, protests, and propaganda wars have surfaced following October 7th. From around the world, anti-Semitic, pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian operatives and groups cry out, Israel is occupying Palestinian land. Israel is a terrorist organization. The Palestinians in Gaza are being oppressed by Israel. Hamas is justified in its butchery of Jewish civilians, and so on. Despite the massive volume of proof, this propaganda war of lies rages on day after day in the UN, on university campuses, in mainstream media, and throughout social media. One of the false accusations posted by Hamas was that Israel had blown up the Shifa hospital in Gaza, when in actuality one of their own rockets misfired near the hospital, leaving a small hole in the parking lot and doing more damage to the vehicles. Sadly, many do not know the facts and ignorantly jump on these bandwagons. Many choose to believe the lies. Many fail to take a stand for truth. You may be hearing of these lies and may be genuinely wondering what is truth. You may be encountering people who are confused. Our overview begins with these words in Genesis, the first book of the Old Testament, or the Tanakh. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country, and from your relatives, and from your father's house, to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." This is found in Genesis 12, verse 1 to 3. With these words, God made a foundational covenant, an eternal covenant, a literal and unconditional covenant with Abram. In this covenant, the Lord promised literal land, literal seed, literal blessing. In Genesis 15, we see that God ratified the covenant with Abram and took full responsibility for it. In Genesis 13, Abram came into the land God had promised him, and the Lord told him to look northward, and southward, eastward, and westward. He told Abram to walk around it. All this land would be given to him and to his descendants forever. Genesis 13, verse 14 to 17. It is important to note that the scriptures lay out far more land than Israel has ever lived on. We can read in Genesis 15, verse 15 to 21, and in other passages of scripture as well. The scriptures teach that God created this world and owns this world. Genesis 1:1 tells us, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." He created it. He owns it. Psalm 24, verse 1 says, "The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof." In Leviticus 25, verse 23, it declares that God, the supreme owner of the promised land, referred to it earlier as Canaan, has sovereignly given designated land to the nation of Israel and has allotted areas within this land to each of the tribes of Israel. God made it very clear that this covenant with Abram would involve descendants or seed and would begin with a promised son who would come forth from Abram's own body. Abraham would have a son. Genesis 15, verse 3 to 6. And this heir would be born to Abram and Sarah, even though they were quite elderly. They were past childbearing years, and yet God promised them a flesh and blood son. As time went on, God confirmed this covenant with Isaac, Genesis 26, and Jacob, Genesis 35. We can also look at Psalm 105, verse 8 to 11. Moving quickly ahead through the centuries, we see that God was patient with Israel and faithful to his covenant with Abraham. We see that God preserved Israel in Egypt during a famine, Genesis 50, verse 20, and Psalm 105. We see Joseph's statement of faith and hope in Genesis 50, verse 24 to 25, when he gave instructions to his brothers to take his bones and bury them in the promised land when they returned. We see the great exodus out of Egypt and the wilderness wanderings under the leadership of Moses. God stated through Moses that the enjoyment of this land would be based on Israel's obedience. Deuteronomy 28-30. Obedience would lead to blessing, whereas disobedience would lead to much pain and scattering among the nations. As we continue on, we see the conquest of the promised land under Joshua. We see the 400-year period of the judges, followed by the kings, beginning with Saul, and followed by David, the man after God's own heart, who defeated the Jebusites and made Jerusalem the capital of Israel around 1000 BC. 1 Chronicles 11, verse 4-9. David's son Solomon built the temple of God on the Temple Mount purchased by David. That was the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. We read of this in 2 Samuel 24, verse 18-25. After Solomon died, the nation of Israel split over taxes, resulting in 2 kingdoms, the northern kingdom of 10 tribes and the southern kingdom of 2 tribes. The southern kingdom was known as Judah. The word Jew comes from the word Judah. The Davidic line continued to rule in Judah. Due to rebellion and disobedience towards God, the northern kingdom was taken into captivity by the Assyrians in 722 BC. Later, the kingdom of Judah would outdo her northern sister in sinful living and disobedience, and consequently be taken captive by the Babylonians over a period of 3 sieges in the time of 609 to 586 BC. This left the throne empty. No king to sit on the Davidic throne. The Davidic throne would continue this way until a future time when is prophesied in Psalm 118, verse 26. We see it say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Jesus quoted this in Matthew 23, verse 37-39. This points to Israel's Messiah, their great king, the greater son of David, who will return to sit on the throne of David. You may check some of these verses out in Psalm 48, verse 1-2, Psalm 110, and 2 Samuel 7, verse 1-7, particularly verse 12-16. After 70 years of captivity in Babylon, a remnant of Jews returned to the land during 3 different returns. The first under Zerubbabel, the second return under Ezra, the priestly scribe, and the third return under Nehemiah. The second temple was built at the first return, and the walls of Jerusalem rebuilt at the third return. The Old Testament prophets prophesied much about the Messiah, the Anointed One, who would come, both as a suffering Messiah and then as a reigning Messiah. When Messiah Jesus came, the seed of the woman, Genesis 3:15, the seed of the Abrahamic covenant, Genesis 12, verse 1-3, and Matthew 1, verse 1-14, that would come through the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's descendants, the promised one who would be born of a virgin, Isaiah 7, verse 14, and chapter 9, verse 6-7, and the historical record in Luke chapter 2, Israel, basically as a nation, did not receive him. John 1, verse 11. They were expecting a reigning king who would destroy the Romans and usher in peace. Not a humble king, not a suffering king. They could not grasp this, and that is a problem even today. Besides this, they could not get their heads around the fact that Jesus said he was God. No man can be God, and that's perfectly right. But God can become man, and that's exactly what he did at the incarnation. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. He was their perfect sacrifice for sin, Isaiah 53. Their perfect high priest, Psalm 110, verse 4. But they rejected him and cried for him to be crucified. Psalm 22. Yet on the third day he rose from the dead, and 40 days later he ascended into heaven to the Father's right hand. Psalm 110, verse 1. Some years after the death and resurrection of Jesus the Messiah, in 70 AD, the city of Jerusalem, along with the temple, was destroyed under Titus and his Roman legions. This, along with the earlier captivities and later the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 AD, resulted in the scattering of the Jewish people throughout the world, the diaspora. Deuteronomy 28-30 spoke about this. But even then, there was a Jewish presence in the land. This was always so. Even at times, it became very small. The centuries that followed were filled with much suffering and anti-Semitism within the nations where the Jews lived. Sadly, even many of those who called themselves Christians or the church believed that God had replaced Israel with the church, that all the curses of the Old Testament were Israel's and all the blessings were the church's. Jews were labeled Christ killers. This teaching and belief, known as replacement theology, is unbiblical and has led to awful acts of anti-Semitism against Jews, such as the Spanish Inquisition, the Crusades, the Russian pogroms, the Holocaust. The homeland, Eretz Israel, has been controlled by different armies over the centuries. The Roman Emperor Hadrian had tried to get rid of everything Jewish, even changing the name of Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina. A temple to Jupiter was built in Jerusalem. Hadrian referred to the land of Syria, Palestina, taken from the word Palestine, Israel's ancient enemies, who lived where present-day Gaza is. In 1897, Theodor Herzl, an Austro-Hungarian Jew, convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. The Zionist movement began to grow and flourish. The basic goal of Zionism was the development of a national state in Palestine, the ancient homeland of the Jews. This was the growing heart's cry of the Jewish nation through these dark times. A Russian-born Jewish biochemist by the name of Chaim Weizmann became a prominent player in the Zionist movement in the earlier years leading up to 1949. Up until World War I, the Ottoman Empire ruled the Jewish homeland. They, along with their allies, were defeated in World War I by a coalition of France, the United Kingdom, the United States, Russia, Italy, and Japan. On October 31, 1917, the British cabinet agreed to support Zionist plans for a Jewish national home. This was communicated in a letter from British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour to Lord Rothschild on November the 2nd, 1917. The contents of this letter became known as the Balfour Declaration. On December the 11th, 1917, in the city of Jerusalem, British General Edmund Allenby stood on the steps of the Citadel of David opposite Christ Church during Hanukkah to proclaim liberation for the Jews. But things became twisted over the next while. The mandate system was instituted by the League of Nations in the early 20th century to administer non-self-governing territories to see to the well-being and advancement of its population. In other words, you can have a homeland, but we will be in charge. On July 24, 1922, the League of Nations entrusted Britain with the mandate for Palestine. Furthermore, they decided on September 1922 that the land east of the Jordan would not be granted to the Jewish nation, but be gifted to the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, who didn't need land. The land between the Jordan and the Mediterranean was divvied up between the Jews and Arabs under the partition plan. That's the beginnings of the two-state solution plan. It is of interest to note that the divisions of land and the creation of countries like Iraq and Jordan by the Allies of World War I, with no thought to geographical and tribal boundaries, with a departure from the Balfour Declaration and the original decision of the League of Nations, the colonization by the Allies has contributed to many problems. On March 17, 1939, under Arab pressure, the British government issued the White Paper, which restricted Jewish immigration into Palestine to 75,000 over a period of 5 years. The following years, from 1939 to 48, were very difficult years. During World War II and the Shoah, which is what the Jewish people prefer to call the Holocaust, millions of Jews, 6 million, young and old, were murdered. Many sought to flee but found no refuge in the nations, and their homeland, Palestine, under British rule, greatly restricted the emigration of Jews. Many of the British soldiers and leaders had anti-Semitic attitudes towards the Jews. Many were very bothered about being posted in the powder keg of Palestine. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was a good friend of Hitler, was committed to the Arab version of the final solution. The Arabs were allowed weapons, but the Jews were forbidden from having any weapons. Many Jews who sought to come to their ancient homeland, seeking refuge, were arrested and placed in detainment camps in Cyprus. In the pre-1948 years, Jews that did get into the land were faced with malaria swamps, a land in ruin that the Arabs did not want. They began, under the intense dangers of anti-Semitism, to drain the swamps and work the land, starting kibbutzim, that's communities based on agriculture. From the 1880s to the establishment of the State of Israel, Jews were purchasing land, the land that God had given them, land that the Arabs thought useless. One major way that they used to purchase land was through the Jewish National Fund. On May 14, 1948, Israel, under the David Ben-Gurion government, declared statehood 8 hours before the end of the British Mandate of Palestine on May 15th. They were immediately thrust into a war defending themselves from a coalition of Arab armies led by Egypt and Syria that sought to destroy them and run them into the sea. Just prior to this war, the Arab nations had told all the Arabs living in Palestine to leave their homes and businesses because they were going to drive Israel into the sea. Israel begged these Arabs to remain. We can live together. You don't have to leave. But the Arabs, under pressure, left. The Arab armies lost. In fact, Israel gained land, and the Arab nations did nothing to help their brethren. Consequently, this resulted in the Arab refugee problem. There is another refugee problem that is rarely mentioned, and that is the Jewish refugee problem. There were many Jews living in Arab countries who were run out. Many were killed, others fled for their lives, losing their homes, businesses, and finances to escape with nothing but the clothes on their back. Over the past years, we have seen the establishment of the State of Israel with an organized structure of leadership and commerce, and massive waves of Jews making Aliyah and returning from the diaspora. The prophet Ezekiel declared under the Spirit of God that the regathering of Israel would begin in unbelief, but will culminate in the future with both spiritual and physical restoration and great blessing. For this you can read Ezekiel 37, Jeremiah 31, verse 31 to 34, and Ezekiel 36, verse 22 to 38. There have been many attacks on Israel over the years that followed. Fedayeen insurgency by Arab guerrilla groups from various Arab countries sought to infiltrate Israel. The Suez Canal crisis, 1956. The Six-Day War, June 1967. The War of Attrition with Egypt. The Yom Kippur War, 1973. The South Lebanon insurgency, where the PLO located in Lebanon to execute terrorist activity between 1971 to 82. The Lebanon War to expel the PLO in 1982. The South Lebanon conflict to deal with Iranian-backed Hezbollah in 1985 to 2000. The two intifadas with their large Palestinian uprisings in Gaza and the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, 1987 to 1993, and 2000 to 2005. The Lebanon War with terrorist group Hezbollah in 2006, Gaza and the terrorist groups PLO, Hamas, etc. Some of the history of Arab terrorism comes from the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, when in 1979, with the exile of the Shah of Iran, Ruhollah Khomeini, or Ayatollah Khomeini, took control of Iran. It is he who turned Iran to Islamic fundamentalism extremism. This resulted in Shiite fundamentalism in Iran, and in other places, Sunni fundamentalism took over. In the 1970s, the Mujahideen resurfaced in Afghanistan. These were guerrilla fighters from various tribes. Volunteers came from other Muslim countries. Osama bin Laden was one of them. Out of this, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS arose. A common goal of Islamic fundamentalism is the eradication of the Jews of Israel. In Islamic eschatology, it is taught that Islam must eradicate every Jew before their version of Messiah can come. Over the years, there have been various American presidents who have tried to implement their peace plans for Israel and its Arab neighbors. They, along with their advisors, so often failed to understand Israel's situation. Much pressure has been placed on this tiny country to give up land, to patiently wait amidst great attacks and threats for peace talks to take place that never worked because the unwillingness of the Arab nations to recognize Israel's right to exist, to recognize this land as the Jews' ancient homeland, and to desire peace with Israel. The tiny state of Israel, not much bigger than the eastern state of New Jersey in America, is surrounded by 22 Arab nations with vast amounts of land, yet Israel has bent over backwards to seek a peace with their neighbors. The solution that has so often been pressed upon Israel has been land for peace. There is still talk, even now, in the midst of this war, about a Palestinian state, despite the fact that there never was a Palestinian state. It does not work. Why do the Arab nations not take in their Arab brothers? Prior to October 7th, 2023, 500,000 Palestinians came through the checkout points into Israel on a daily basis to work at various jobs with salaries that are equal to the European pay grade. They received nothing from Lebanon or Jordan. It was also this act of care for the Palestinian Arabs in Gaza and the West Bank, or Judea, Samaria, which compromised Israel to the events of October 7th. Terrorists and pro-Hamas Arabs came in under the guise of work permits and collected information in preparation for the massacre of October 7th. Some Palestinian Arab spokesmen are speaking out in a variety of venues today, telling, for example, the EU, the world, that they support Israel. They are tired of the lies, of the oppression from these terrorist groups. the unjust way Lebanon and Jordan have been treating them, the way the EU and others have blindly fallen for the lies by supporting the wrong parties and penalizing Israel. They realize that their neighbor Israel has been good to them. Sadly, at this time, many around the world are ignorantly calling for a ceasefire. But a ceasefire would only allow Hamas to regroup and stockpile weapons to plan to repeat October 7th. Yet Israel has found it hard to be in this spot. They feel like they are between a rock and a hard place, with the need to deal fully with Hamas and eradicate them, and also the need to free their hostages. And so there was a brief ceasefire that took place for a few days, and yet in the midst of that, from the beginning to the end, when Hamas broke this ceasefire, Hamas continually played games, and hostages were released at lots of pressure and begging, and they came out in dribs and drabs. The stories of these released hostages are now coming out, stories of horror, stories that involved torture, deprivation of medical treatment, starvation, being drugged and moved around in tunnels of darkness, forcing them to watch videos of the massacre, having guns held to their heads if they cried, making them talk in whispers, keeping them in darkness, rape, and etc. Hamas videotaped and posted the exchange of the hostages, and some of these hostages were drugged before being exchanged. And they tried to deceive the world into thinking they were a caring organization by trying to force the hostages to wave and smile and act like they didn't really want to go. There are still over 100 hostages being held. Everything is very volatile. How many are alive and who has been murdered? It is clear that some already have been murdered. There's great pressure about who should govern Gaza. There is the pressure to turn it over to the Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas. But remember that the PA is the PLO, and Mahmoud Abbas is a Holocaust denier and protege of Yasser Arafat. Fatah is the PA's terrorist group, which supports the charter of Hamas, and even boasts about doing something greater against Israel than the October massacre. But for now, why is all this happening? Why is Israel under attack constantly? What is it that is at the bottom of all this barbaric wickedness, this seething hatred for the Jew, this iron steel commitment to seek to totally eradicate Israel? Why do the supporters of Hamas shout and celebrate in the streets of the world? Why do the mainstream media continually lie? Why does the UNS, the United Nations Security Council, show no support? Why does the UN publish resolution after resolution against Israel? Recently, it was discovered that a person hired by UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency, was holding a hostage from October 7th in their attic and starving them. The UNRWA facilities in Gaza are also used as places to store weapons and rockets, as places to brainwash children and youth into hating Jews and becoming Hamas terrorists. Psalm 2 verse 1 asks, "Why are the nations in an uproar and the peoples devising a vain thing?" Psalm 129 verse 1 to 3 cries, "Many times they have persecuted me from my youth up, yet they have not prevailed against me. The plowers plowed upon my back. They lengthened their furrows." Well, in conclusion, there's a number of things to consider. First, understand that the land situated in what is called Canaan or Palestine was divinely given to the nation of Israel approximately 4,000 years ago by God Almighty. Galilee, Judea, and Samaria and the Negev are all part of Israel's inheritance from God. Secondly, understand that the issue is really not about land. This has already been seen in the past with Land for Peace. In the failure of the two-state solution, over these past years with Gaza, Hamas and other terrorists, anti-Semitic groups both regionally and around the globe do not want Israel as a people to exist. That is at the bottom. But there's something even deeper than that. Understand that at the very center of this is a hatred for God, a hatred towards the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the one true God, the God of the Bible. Understand also that the enemy behind all of this is the evil one, Satan, who seeks to discredit God's promises and plans, and people, Israel, who attacks the apple of God's eye. Also understand that God will win. In fact, he has as good as won. Right now, God is working with his nation, Israel, to draw them to himself. The prophets speak much about this. God is using his nation to speak to the world. In the final end, God will deal with the nations for what they have done to his nation. I, the Lord, Genesis 12, verse 3, will curse those who curse you. Understand that today is the day to call upon the Lord. The gospel of Jesus the Messiah is the only answer. I trust this will encourage us and also help us think clearly and give us some answers to respond in this world where so many are denying the truth. May God bless you.